In the American Wild West, one job came with absolute authority over an entire county and a life expectancy that made outlaws look lucky. The sheriff wore the badge. The badge wore him down, and the frontier buried them both. Consider the position. You are the only law for hundreds of square miles. You collect taxes from men who would shoot a tax collector on principle. You arrest fugitives with no backup, no radio, no reinforcements riding over the hill. You serve warrants on ranch compounds where every hand carries a rifle and every dog has been trained to hate strangers. And when the sun goes down and the circuit judge has moved on to the next territory, you are the one who carries out the sentence. You perform executions, pulling the lever on the gallows yourself. Your hands, your scaffold, your rope around a man's neck. And when the town eventually decides that you are the problem, when the same voters who handed you the badge decide you have become more dangerous than the men you were hired to stop, you become the hunted. This was not a career. It was a countdown, and it was cursed from the very beginning, born from medieval power, transplanted to a lawless frontier, and twisted into a death sentence for the men who accepted it. By the end of this video, you will understand why pinning on a sheriff's badge in the Wild West was less a career choice and more a slow-motion destruction, and why the men who wore it were consumed by the very authority they were given. One sheriff was elected to protect a gold rush town and may have been robbing it blind the entire time. The vigilantes who hanged him were so certain of his guilt that they did not bother with a trial. But more than a century later, historians still are not sure they got the right man. And in Tombstone, Arizona, a marshal's decision to enforce a single gun law led to the most famous shootout in American history, 30 seconds that turned brothers into killers and lawmen into legends. This is the curse of being a sheriff in the Wild West. Let me set the stage. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of history's most dangerous jobs, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. Now, let me take you back, not to the American frontier, but to 9th century England, where this curse began. The word sheriff is a corruption of shire reeve, and the shire reeve was exactly what it sounds like, the guardian of the shire. In 9th century England, this was a community leader, a local man chosen by the people of his district, someone trusted to settle disputes, organize labor, and keep a rough kind of peace. He was a servant of the community. But that did not last. As the English monarchy consolidated power, the crown reached down and co-opted the role. The shire reeve stopped serving the village and started serving the king. He became a tax collector, a jailer, a fugitive hunter, an enforcer of royal court orders. The man who once answered to his neighbors now answered to the throne, and his neighbors had no say in the matter. This dual identity, public servant and state enforcer, was encoded into the role from its very first breath. It was a contradiction that would never be resolved, only exported. The Norman conquest of 1066 did not destroy the sheriff. It entrenched him deeper into the machinery of governance. And over the next century and a half, sheriffs accumulated so much unchecked power, became so prone to corruption and abuse, that when the English barons finally forced King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, that foundational document of English liberty devoted 27 of its clauses to restricting what sheriffs could do. 27 clauses. That is how dangerous the role had already become, not to the sheriffs, but to everyone around them. Now fast forward 4 centuries, the English colonists who crossed the Atlantic brought the sheriff with them, packed alongside their Bibles and their land charters. In 1634, Captain William Stone became the first American sheriff in Virginia's Northamptonshire. The word shire, itself a ghost of the English system still haunting the New World. By 1652, William Waters became the first elected sheriff, and with that election came the uniquely American twist. The sheriff now needed the people's approval to keep his job. He was not appointed by a distant king. He stood before voters, and in the Wild West, that meant standing before armed men, cattle barons, saloon owners and outlaws, and promising to keep order without getting killed. The political nature of the role would prove to be one of its most lethal features. The Wild West sheriff was typically a man of charisma first, and gunfighting skill second. He won elections on force of personality and local reputation. He held office at the pleasure of a community that could turn on him between one Saturday night and the next. He was one man, maybe two if he could scrape together enough county funds to pay a deputy, responsible for a jurisdiction that might stretch across thousands of square miles of desert, mountain, and open range. No institution behind him, no academy training. Just the star, the gun, and whatever nerve he brought to the job. By the mid-1800s, the American frontier was detonating westward. Gold rushes in California and Montana, cattle drives pushing north from Texas. Railroad expansion hammering steel across the plains, all of it pouring desperate, armed, ambitious men into territories with almost no institutional law. The sheriff was supposed to be the answer, one elected man, one tin star, one set of duties inherited from medieval England, dropped into the most volatile landscape in the Western Hemisphere. The question was never whether the job would break the men who held it. The question was how fast. What did the job actually look like day to day? What did a sheriff have to do, and what tools did he have to do it with? The answer is grimmer than any Hollywood Western has ever shown you. Start with the duties inherited from England. Keeping the peace, collecting taxes, maintaining the county jail, pursuing fugitives, serving court orders. On parchment, in a governed society, these were administrative tasks. On the American frontier, each one was a potential death sentence. Collecting taxes meant riding alone to remote homesteads and cattle operations, owned by men who viewed taxation as theft, backed by the threat of a tin badge. These were not citizens who would file a formal complaint if they disagreed with their assessment. They had rifles leaning against doorframes and dogs that could smell a government man from a quarter mile. Maintaining the jail meant guarding prisoners in a structure made of wood and hope, a building that a determined mob could dismantle in under an hour, with axes, ropes, and enough whiskey-fueled rage. Pursuing fugitives meant riding into open country where an ambush waited behind every canyon wall, every ridgeline, every dry creek bed choked with mesquite and shadow. And then there were the duties that the dime novels never dramatized. Sheriffs were often required to perform punishments themselves, floggings, banishment enforced at gunpoint, and hangings. The sheriff was not simply the man who arrested you, he was the man who built the scaffold, tested the trapdoor, measured the rope, placed the noose around your neck, checked the knot, and pulled the lever. He was arresting officer, jailer, and executioner, all wearing the same star, all compressed into one man standing on a wooden platform while the town watched. This was not a job. It was a gauntlet, and the county expected you to run it every single day. But here is where it gets truly impossible. Consider the specific tensions that transformed a dangerous job into an unsurvivable one. In Tombstone, Arizona, an 1881 ordinance required all visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering town, either at a hotel or at the lawman's office. On paper, a sensible public safety measure. In practice, it meant a sheriff or marshal had to approach armed strangers, cowboys fresh off cattle drives, drifters passing through, outlaws with warrants in 3 territories, and demand they hand over their weapons. The men who refused were not writing letters to the town council, they were reaching for iron. And the sheriff was not the only authority figure on the frontier, but he was frequently the most exposed. Town marshals handled jurisdiction within city limits. Federal marshals pursued federal crimes across state and territorial lines. The military exercised authority on reservations and federal lands. Texas Rangers operated with broad and sometimes terrifying latitude. These overlapping, often contradictory authorities created a landscape of jurisdictional confusion that outlaws exploited with ruthless efficiency. A sheriff might pursue a fugitive for days across brutal terrain only to watch the man cross a county line into a jurisdiction where no one was waiting, and no one cared. When the situation exceeded what one man could handle, the sheriff had a single institutional tool at his disposal: the posse. He could deputize ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, miners, stable hands, arm them with whatever was available, and ride out. It sounds like a system. It was barely organized chaos. Posse members had no training, no discipline, and loyalty that depended entirely on whether the cause seemed worth dying for that particular afternoon. And forming a posse announced your weakness to the entire county. The sheriff needs help. The sheriff cannot handle this alone. The posse was the most powerful and most dangerous instrument the frontier sheriff possessed. Powerful because it multiplied force. Dangerous because it obliterated the line between law enforcement and armed mob. That blur between legal authority and vigilante rage would prove fatal for outlaws, for bystanders, and for the sheriffs themselves. The stage was set. Across the frontier, men were pinning on stars and walking into the teeth of this impossible job. Some would become legends, others would become cautionary tales, and a few would become both. Ellis County, Kansas, 1869. The county is drowning. Violence spills out of saloons nightly. Drunken brawls escalate into knife fights escalate into shootings, and the bodies are starting to stack up faster than the undertaker can build boxes. The citizens need someone who can stop the bleeding. They elect James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, to the office of sheriff. The community hired a killer to stop the killing. Hickok is not a man who negotiates. He is tall, long-haired, cold-eyed, a dead shot with a pair of revolvers, and he carries a reputation that walks into a room 3 steps before he does. Ellis County did not elect him for his administrative skills or his understanding of property law. They elected him because he was the most dangerous man available, and they wanted that danger pointed at their enemies. And Hickok delivers. Within his first months as sheriff, he kills Bill Mulvey. He kills Samuel Strawhan, both during his tenure, both in the course of what he considers law enforcement. These are not arrests that escalated. These are not judicial proceedings that went sideways. They are shootings, fast, close range, and final. Hickok's philosophy of law enforcement can be summarized in a sentence: cause trouble, and he will put you in the ground. But here is where the curse sinks its teeth in. The very lethality that makes Hickok effective makes him ungovernable. A sheriff who shoots first and never asks questions is useful exactly as long as you agree with his choice of targets. The moment a citizen wonders whether Wild Bill might turn that speed and accuracy in the wrong direction, the calculation changes. Hickok stops being the solution and starts being the threat. Ellis County ousts him after just months, not because he failed, because he succeeded in a way that terrified the people who put him there. He did not lose his badge to an outlaw's bullet. He lost it to the voters. The curse was not just violence from the outside. It was rejection from the very people you bled for. What happened next, in county after county, followed the same brutal pattern. Lincoln County, New Mexico, 1878. Sheriff William Brady assembles a posse to restore order during what history will remember as the Lincoln County War, a vicious entanglement of cattle barons, corrupt merchants, and hired guns, all claiming legitimate authority. On the opposing side stands Billy the Kid and his regulators, a group that considers itself the rightful arm of the law. Both sides carry badges or warrants or claims of legal sanction. Both sides shoot to kill. This is posse against posse, the tool the sheriff was given to extend his reach, to multiply his authority, becomes a weapon wielded by everyone. Sheriff Brady does not survive the war. He is gunned down on the streets of Lincoln. The mechanism designed to support the sheriff is the mechanism that destroys him. The line between law enforcement and civil war dissolves entirely, and in the smoke and confusion, no one can tell which side of that line they are standing on. But not every sheriff went down fighting. Some went down cheating. Texas John Slaughter of Cochise County, Arizona, represents a different model entirely. A cattleman by trade, Slaughter handles the sheriff's duties with the quiet efficiency of a rancher culling predators. He tracks outlaws personally, riding alone into the desert, managing problems far from town and far from witnesses. Slaughter survives. His approach is private, patient, and effective. But it demands a constitution that most men do not possess. Total comfort with isolation, unflinching self-reliance, and a willingness to operate in the space between law and something harder to name. Most sheriffs are politicians first, lawmen second, and gunfighters a distant and reluctant third. The Slaughter model works for Slaughter. It does not scale. We have seen what happens to the sheriffs who fought too hard and the sheriffs who fought alone. But the frontier held an even darker possibility, one that shook the very concept of law and order to its foundations. What if the man wearing the badge was the most dangerous outlaw in the territory? What if the sheriff, the one man everyone trusted to stand between them and chaos, was the one engineering the chaos? In a frozen Montana mining town, one sheriff's double life would lead to a reckoning so savage it still haunts historians today, and the question of whether justice was served has never been answered. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Before we reach the mountains of Montana, we need to reckon with a piece of the sheriff's duty that rarely appears in the legends. The executioner's burden, not the dramatic gunfight, not the gallows. Imagine standing on a wooden platform with your hand on a lever, and below that lever a trapdoor, and standing on that trapdoor a man whose neck is in a noose that you tied. You arrested this man. You fed him in your jail. You may have spoken with him through the bars, learned his name, heard his excuses or his silence. And now you are going to kill him, legally, publicly, with the whole town standing below the scaffold watching you do it. The creak of new rope pulled taut against the crossbeam, the bang of the trap-door swinging open into empty air, and then the silence that follows, the silence of a crowd processing what it has just witnessed, a silence that settles on the sheriff's shoulders and never fully lifts. In frontier towns where a circuit judge might pass through once a season, the sheriff was the entire justice system compressed into a single man. He was not just the law. He was the consequence, and every hanging took something from the man who performed it that could never be given back. These men were not trained for this. They were elected officials, former cowboys, former miners, sometimes former outlaws who had crossed to the other side of the badge. The emotional toll of killing legally, repeatedly, with the condemned man's eyes fixed on yours and the community judging your composure, this is the dimension of the curse that left no visible wounds. Some sheriffs turned to whiskey. Some became erratic, swinging between paralysis and brutality. Some simply went quiet in a way their families noticed, but could not name. The job did not only risk your life from bullets and ambushes, it hollowed you out from the inside. And the town that put you on that platform would judge you regardless. A sheriff who seemed unbothered by the gallows was a monster. A sheriff who flinched was a coward. There was no correct way to kill a man and keep your soul intact. But the gallows were not the only thing corroding the badge. In Bannock, Montana, the corruption ran so deep it swallowed the sheriff whole. Bannock, Montana Territory, 1863. A gold rush settlement clinging to the mountains, swollen with miners, prospectors, gamblers, and the predators who trailed them like wolves following a wounded herd. Gold dust is the currency, suspicion is the atmosphere, and the town desperately needs someone to impose order. Henry Plummer steps forward. He is charismatic, well-spoken, and carries himself with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being believed. The town elects him sheriff on the strength of his personality and his promise to bring stability to the chaos. And for a time it seems to work. Plummer organizes. He projects competence. He wears the badge like it was forged for him. But the robberies do not stop. Miners are ambushed on trails outside of town. Gold shipments vanish between Bannock and the SA offices. Men disappear into the mountains and are found weeks later, if they are found at all. And slowly, like frost creeping across a window pane, a terrible suspicion crystallizes among the citizens. What if the man they elected to protect them is the one preying on them? The accusation, when it finally took shape, was staggering. Plummer, the whispers said, was the secret leader of a gang called the Innocents, not a petty official skimming a percentage for himself, but a criminal architect running a network of robberies, ambushes, and murders from behind the cover of his badge. The stolen gold was estimated at $75,000, a fortune in 1863 currency, wealth extracted through betrayal of the most fundamental kind. The evidence was circumstantial. Robbery patterns that seemed to mirror Plummer's knowledge of gold shipment schedules, known associates of the sheriff spotted near crime scenes, confessions extracted under duress, whispered accusations traded in saloons and mining camps. But there was no trial, no formal charges, no courtroom, no jury of 12. What came instead was vigilante justice in its purest and most terrifying form. In January of 1864, a group of Bannack citizens, men who had cast votes for Plummer, who had shaken his hand, who had entrusted him with their safety, dragged him through the frozen streets to the gallows, the same scaffold that Plummer himself had likely used during his tenure. The same crossbeam. January air so cold their breath hung in clouds lit by torchlight on snow. The man who had pulled the lever on the condemned now stood where they had stood. The noose that had been his tool became his sentence. They hanged Henry Plummer without a trial, without a defense, without appeal. And here is what transforms this from a crime story into something that still unsettles historians a century and a half later. Plummer's guilt has never been proven. The evidence was never tested by cross-examination. The vigilantes became judge, jury, and executioner, the precise consolidation of lethal power that the sheriff system was supposedly designed to prevent. If Plummer was guilty, then the badge had been the ultimate disguise, a predator wearing the skin of a protector. If he was innocent, then the citizens of Bannack murdered the one man sworn to shield them from exactly this kind of mob violence. Sheriff Updike, also in Montana, was indicted for embezzlement, resigned his office, and was executed by vigilantes in 1866. The pattern was unmistakable. When a community lost faith in the badge, they did not wait for an election. They reached for a rope. The curse of the badge was not just that it made you a target for outlaws, it made you a target for everyone. And when trust broke, the fall was fatal. But the deadliest 30 seconds in Wild West history were still to come. Tombstone, Arizona, October 26, 1881. A boomtown built on silver, saturated with money, whiskey, ambition, and grudges that had been compounding for months. Virgil Earp serves as town marshal, the man responsible for maintaining order within city limits. And Tombstone has the very gun law that had brought them all to this street, the ordinance requiring visitors to surrender their weapons. Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, are in town. They are armed. Word reaches Virgil Earp that the Clantons and McClorys are carrying firearms in open violation of the ordinance, gathered near the OK Corral on Fremont Street. Virgil Earp makes the decision that will define the rest of his life and the lives of everyone standing on that street. He chooses to enforce the law. He deputizes his brothers, Wyatt Earp, who had earlier served as a deputy marshal in Kansas, and Morgan Earp. He also brings Doc Holliday, a tuberculosis-ravaged dentist turned gambler turned gunfighter, whose loyalty to the Earps is absolute, and whose temperament is a fuse that has already been lit. 4 men with badges walking toward a confrontation that none of them fully understands is about to become the most famous gunfight in American history. Fremont Street. Late afternoon. The October sun sits low and the light comes in at a slant, catching the dust that hangs over everything. Wooden storefronts line both sides of the narrow vacant lot beside Fly's photography studio, near the OK Corral. The Earps and Holiday approach in a line, coats pushed back from their hips, hands loose near holsters. Billy Clanton and the McClorys see them coming. These are also men with families, with reasons they believe they are in the right, with the same blood and fear pumping through their veins as the men walking toward them. The gunfight lasts approximately 30 seconds. In that sliver of time, roughly 30 shots are fired at distances measured in feet, not yards. Black powder smoke fills the narrow space between the buildings, so thick that the shooters can barely distinguish friend from enemy. The sound is not the clean crack of a Hollywood revolver. It is the deafening concussion of heavy-caliber weapons discharged in an enclosed corridor of wood and adobe, blasts that compress the air and leave ears ringing long after the last trigger is pulled. Billy Clanton goes down. Tom McClory is hit. Frank McClory staggers into the street and falls. On the Earp side, Virgil takes a round in the calf. Morgan is shot across the shoulders. Holiday is grazed. Wyatt Earp, standing in the center of the firestorm, is untouched. When the smoke dissipates, Billy Clanton is dead or dying. Both McClory brothers are dead. The Earps and Holiday are still standing. 30 seconds, 30 rounds. 3 dead, and the curse of the badge had claimed its most famous victims, on both sides of the gunsmoke. But then came the silence. And the silence was worse. The gunfight at the OK Corral was not a conclusion. It was an ignition point. Weeks later, Virgil Earp was ambushed on the streets of Tombstone, shotgun blasts shattering his left arm, leaving him permanently maimed. Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards, shot through a window, a bullet in the back. The men who enforced the law became the hunted. Wyatt Earp's subsequent vendetta ride across Arizona, conducted entirely outside the boundaries of legal authority, obliterated every remaining distinction between justice and revenge. One decision to enforce the law, 2 brothers shattered, and a legend built on wreckage. Now pull back. See the pattern. Across the Wild West, in county after county, territory after territory, the same mechanism ground through its operators. The sheriff who fought too hard was ousted or killed by the people he protected. The sheriff who held back was replaced or simply ignored into irrelevance. The sheriff suspected of corruption was hanged without trial. And the honest sheriff, the man who did everything right, was still a target for outlaws, for vigilantes, for political rivals, for citizens who had elected him in a moment of fear and resented him in a moment of calm. The cascade is relentless. Hickok, ousted by voters after months of doing exactly what they asked him to do. Brady, killed by the posse war he tried to contain. Plummer, hanged by the town he swore to protect on evidence that may not have survived a single day in court. The Earps, shot, crippled, and driven from Tombstone. Updike, executed by vigilantes. The thread connecting all of them is not incompetence or cowardice or corruption. It is the fundamental impossibility of the role itself. The sheriff stood at the intersection of every tension on the frontier, settlers against ranchers, miners against claim jumpers, citizens against outlaws, federal authority against local power, wealthy interests against working men. He was supposed to mediate all of it with a tin badge, a revolver, and the charisma that had won him an election. And when any of those tensions detonated, as they inevitably did, the sheriff was standing at ground zero. Tenures were measured in months, not years. Some counties burned through sheriffs the way a campfire burns through kindling, each man lasting until the next election, the next bullet, or the next mob. The phrase, short tenure, recurs so frequently in frontier records that it ceases to be remarkable, not because the men were weak, because the job was engineered to destroy whoever stepped into it. The badge did not protect you. It painted a target on your chest, and the target was visible from every direction. One man, one badge, 1,000 ways to die. The full weight of what the frontier sheriff system produced becomes clear only when you stop counting gunfights and start counting outcomes. The Wild West did not merely kill sheriffs with bullets, it killed them with whiskey. with paranoia, with political treachery, and with the slow, corrosive toll of being simultaneously executioner and target, protector and suspect, authority and servant. Hickok, the man once elected to save Ellis County, was dead by 1876, not in a gunfight, not in the line of duty, shot in the back of the head during a poker game in Deadwood, South Dakota, by a drifter named Jack McCall. He was holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights, the dead man's hand. The lawman who became too dangerous for the law died with no badge, no warning, and no chance to draw the weapons that had made his name. Virgil Earp, the marshal who believed in the law enough to walk down Fremont Street to enforce it, never fully recovered from the ambush that followed. His arm, shattered by buckshot, remained permanently damaged. He spent years drifting between mining towns and minor appointments, a diminished echo of the man who had deputized his brothers and marched toward the sound of inevitability. Morgan Earp did not receive even the grim dignity of a confrontation. Killed through a window, a bullet in the back while he leaned over a billiards table, in a moment so ordinary it could have been any evening of any week. The noose that may have killed an innocent man, Plummer's noose, became a symbol not of frontier justice, but of the frontier's inability to tell the difference between justice and murder when the badge was involved. But it would be a distortion to suggest that every sheriff was destroyed. Men like Pat Garrett, Bat Masterson, and Bill Tillman served with genuine courage and professional competence across the Western Territories. They enforced the law, survived their tenures, managed the politics of their communities, and built reputations grounded in steady work rather than spectacular violence. They represent what was likely the majority, the sheriffs who did the grinding daily work, collected the taxes, ran the jails, pursued the fugitives, fed the prisoners, settled the disputes, and went home alive. They are less remembered because competence does not make for a compelling legend. But even these survivors bore the marks. Garrett, the man who shot Billy the Kid, was himself murdered in 1908, shot on a desolate road in New Mexico under circumstances that remain murky. Masterson eventually abandoned the frontier entirely, relocating to New York City, where he spent his remaining years as a sports writer, as far from the dust and the badge as geography allowed. Tilghman was shot and killed by a corrupt federal prohibition agent in 1924, decades after the Wild West had supposedly closed its books. The frontier did not care how good you were. The badge collected its debt from everyone. The legend, of course, outran the reality almost immediately. Dime novels, cheap and sensational and spectacularly inaccurate, began circulating in eastern cities within years of the events they purported to describe. Hickok was already a mythological figure before a bullet ended his life in a Deadwood saloon. Wyatt Earp lived long enough to consult on early Hollywood productions, personally shaping the mythology that would outlast him by generations. The story of the OK Corral, the hanging of Plummer, the Lincoln County War, all were exaggerated, simplified, and polished into narratives that audiences who had never smelled black powder smoke or heard the drop of a trapdoor could consume as entertainment. The real men, complicated, afraid, sometimes brave and sometimes brutal, often both in the same afternoon, were compressed into archetypes: the noble sheriff, the corrupt sheriff, the fastest draw in the West. And the curse became a selling point. It moved tickets. It sold paperback novels. It became the mythology of an entire nation's self-image. But strip away the myth, and what remains is something more uncomfortable than any Western film has ever shown. The sheriff system, transplanted from medieval England, stretched across an impossible frontier and placed in the hands of elected amateurs with tin stars, was never designed to function under these conditions. It was a feudal solution to an industrial age problem. And the men who stepped into the gap paid the price with their bodies, their sanity, and their lives. The gunfights, the hangings, the vigilante mobs, these were not aberrations. They were the system functioning exactly as its architecture guaranteed. One man, one star, and a landscape that answered authority with lead. But the battle's end was just the beginning of the legend. The Wild West sheriff did not vanish. He evolved. The office of sheriff still exists in every state in the Union, except Alaska and Connecticut. Modern sheriffs are still elected by the communities they serve. They still operate county jails. They still execute court orders. The medieval architecture of the Shire Reeve, that guardian of the Shire born in 9th century England, still pulses through the nervous system of American law enforcement more than 1,000 years later. But the frontier years stripped away the insulation that had protected the role for centuries. In England, the sheriff had the Crown's military apparatus behind him. In the American West, he had a badge and whatever courage he carried in his chest. The experiment proved, in blood and rope and ballot, that concentrating law enforcement authority in a single elected individual within a landscape of competing armed factions with no institutional support structure was a blueprint for destruction of the outlaws, of the communities, and of the sheriffs themselves. The mythologization began before the gun smoke cleared, and has never stopped. The men who walked out of that 30-second storm on Fremont Street have been the subject of more than a dozen major films. Wyatt Earp's name carries more recognition than most presidents who served during his lifetime. Hickok's dead man's hand is still invoked at poker tables around the world. And Plummer, whose guilt is still debated by serious historians with access to records the vigilantes never consulted, has become the foundational archetype of the corrupt lawman in American fiction. Every crooked sheriff in every novel and film owes a debt to a man who may never have committed the crimes he died for. What vanishes inside the legend is the ordinary. Most of a sheriff's hours were not spent in gunfights or on the gallows. They were spent riding county roads, collecting taxes, serving legal papers, feeding prisoners who cursed his name, and standing between drunks on Saturday nights, trying to keep a disagreement about a card game from becoming a killing. The grind was the rule. The gunfight was the exception. And the grind is what broke most of them long before a bullet ever could. The tin star, the sheriff's badge. In 9th century England, it represented the king's reach into the farthest corners of his domain. In the American Wild West, it meant you were simultaneously the most powerful and most expendable person in the county. The Shire Reeve who once collected taxes for a king became the gunfighter, the executioner, the posse leader, the political target, and too often the corpse. The curse of being a sheriff in the Wild West was never any single bullet, any single hanging, any single betrayal. It was the job itself, an impossible role that demanded ordinary men become judge, enforcer, executioner, and politician in a land that respected none of those titles and feared all of them. The badge did not protect them. It marked them, and the frontier collected every debt. If this story gripped you, subscribe for more, because history's darkest chapters are the ones most worth understanding.